Why do successful people often miss the early signs that something is off? This is pretty common where I hear founders, entrepreneurs, high performers, they look successful on the outside. Everything seems to be going well. But what's happening is they're actually compensating, right? They're adapting while their capacity, while everything under the surface is kind of slowly decaying and declining. And because they're still able to kind of get by and get through the day and perform and, get their daily tasks accomplished, they think they're fine. And the decline doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal to them because they're compensating, they're adapting. And, we are, I like to say, masters of adaptation, right? We're able to adapt to whatever the situation is. And as our daily performance declines, we just keep lowering the bar and lowering the bar, and eventually that becomes, a new baseline that's now normalized. And so the decline is subtle, and it may be ever so subtle, like my brain's not working as clearly as it did before, or maybe it's, my energy is a little lower, or, I have a little bit of, decreased energy after lunch. I want to maybe take a nap. Maybe it's recovery is slower. Aches and pains take a lot longer to heal. You go to the gym and 3 days later you're still sore, or you injure yourself exercising or a sport, and it takes longer than it used to for those injuries to recover. Maybe you're depending more and more on caffeine. That's pretty common to be drinking coffee all the way up until noon. Or maybe you're just really not feeling like you're at the level you once were. You feel old. You feel like just think nothing's working, like things aren't working like they used to. Sometimes issues in the bedroom as well, where, especially for men, performance isn't the same as they get older. And a lot of reasons underlying all of this. But the reality is that a lot of men especially will normalize this, and they'll adapt to this really lower level of performance that they're dealing with. And I think a common thing that people feel is that they just don't feel like themselves anymore. It's not that there's anything major or dramatic. There's not a crisis happening. And, you go to your doctor and you tell your primary care doctor, I just don't feel like myself anymore. They're going to look at you and think you're crazy for being there. Or they may run some basic, ridiculous labs that don't tell you anything. They're, it's looking for a disease, looking for a crisis situation. And the doctor will tell you you're fine. And super common. So, that's the problem where traditional medicine is looking for, major problems, where we're looking for subtle decline in performance on a daily basis. And that's just a different ballgame entirely. Now, why do standard metrics miss this decline? Well, again, the real reason here is that standard testing is looking for disease, for diagnosis codes, whether you have sign of a heart attack, sign of sepsis, sign of diabetes, sign of kidney failure, liver failure, stuff like that. We're not talking about that, right? We're not talking about being, quote, normal. We're talking about being optimized. We're talking about, being able to perform at that high level and achieve the success that you were achieving for many years that suddenly you find is much harder to achieve and reach. And so we're not looking for major problems. We're looking for subtle dysfunction that really exists long before any real pathology occurs. And that's really the difference between what we do in precision performance medicine and traditional medicine. Really night and day distinction there. Next question I hear is, what are we missing? What are the tests that we should be doing? Well, I think there's a lot of tests that look at areas of dysfunction or decline that traditional medicine misses. One of them is hormones. When you go to your doctor, they're going to check some basic markers of hormones. If you ask for them, even sometimes they don't check them at all. And those markers are not even the right markers, number one. For example, they're testing total testosterone when you want to be looking at free testosterone. And I'll talk about this in a separate video where, we want to focus on free testosterone. That's the bioavailable active form. Thyroid hormone, you want to be looking at free T3 thyroid hormone. Most doctors are looking at TSH, which is the signal from the brain, which is not the right marker you want to be looking at. We want to be looking at DHEA and IGF-1, which is a surrogate for growth hormone levels. We want to be looking at nitric oxide, which is a hormone that you can measure with a saliva sample. Most doctors aren't looking at any of these, so hormones is a big deal. Looking at metabolic health. Metabolic health it means blood sugar control. And most people will think of that as, oh, I'm diabetic or I'm not. Well, it's not quite so black and white. It's not quite so simple. There's a spectrum of what we call insulin sensitivity, which means how well do you regulate and quickly, dynamically control your blood sugar as you have daily activity, as you have stress, as you eat, as you work out, all these environmental changes that are happening, and normally your body's able to very quickly adapt and regulate blood sugar. We can measure that. Traditional medicine is looking at just your fasting glucose. Doesn't tell the whole story. We want to be looking at fasting insulin, which is much more accurate, and then hemoglobin A1C, for example. Want to look at things like ferritin, which is an iron marker, but also looks at signs of systemic inflammation. CRP is another great marker of inflammation. LPPLA2, these are markers of vascular inflammation that we can measure as well. Cardiovascular health, when you think of lipids, a big marker that most doctors don't ever look at is ApoB, or LP little a, that looks like capital L, little p, and then little a in parentheses. That's an LDL subtype. These are all blind spots, just blood testing alone I've talked about here, that traditional medicine doesn't look at. We could look at markers of gut health, your microbiome. I'm going to talk in another video in depth about microbiome testing and how important that is. But the microbiome controls everything. It controls energy and focus and metabolism, your ability to burn fat and build muscle and sleep, and it regulates so much that's happening that we want to be able to measure that. Nervous system function, we can actually measure this as well. Heart rate variability is a great surrogate for your nervous system regulation. And when it comes to internal stress versus recovery, we want to measure that because that's really a very common underlying problem as it relates to your daily performance and energy and brain function, etc. So all of these are some of the tests that we look at in precision performance medicine on a daily basis that most doctors in traditional medicine never touch. And, I like to think of it as you can't optimize what you can't see. And so you need to be doing the testing to understand what may be holding you back, what in your biology needs to be addressed to really, get you back to where you want to be. So what needs to actually change? Well, I think it requires that we take really a strategic reframe here in terms of how do we look at this. First, we rely on, deeper visibility with doing the testing, doing the blood testing, microbiome, looking at cortisol, tracking sleep and stress levels, and really taking a deep dive into all of these biomarkers that can help us understand what's working and what's not working. Stop relying on the basic surface level metrics that traditional medicine looks at that don't help you unless you're having a heart attack or a kidney stone or you're in a motor vehicle accident or you're in sepsis. Those labs don't help you otherwise. Dynamic tracking. Using wearable technology and, other devices to measure how you're doing on a daily basis and see if what you're doing is working or not and what areas need improvement. And so I think it really starts with awareness, with, identifying what are those constraints that are holding you back, you don't even realize are there. And that helps you create a plan. You go to a lot of these peptide clinics now and these online telehealth companies, and they just want to sell you a bunch of peptides and a bunch of products when you need to first identify what's the actual problem that we're trying to fix here. How do we get things working like it's supposed to? And it starts with awareness, starts with visibility. And that's why, in the test design and track peak launch system, it starts with test so you can really identify what those issues are. So I think that one of the biggest dangers for leaders, for successful, high performers, isn't the sudden collapse that you have a sudden crisis or major issue. It's the slow, quiet, gradual decline and decay that you gradually and quietly adapt to without even realizing it. The lower energy, the poor focus, the decreased resilience, decreased recovery status, that it starts to become normal, becomes your new baseline. You stop questioning it until one day you realize, what the hell happened? How have I drifted so far off?